The global mission, the nature of DEA's global international operations is extremely important, because what this does is allows DEA to move beyond U.S. borders into source countries and address the problem in several ways: to go after the sources of the drugs, production, chemicals, build partnerships with host country nation law enforcement to build their capacities. We work with them shoulder to shoulder, and increases DEA's capability to interdict drugs before they get into the United States, in essence saving lives before dangerous drugs can get into the U.S. The international operations improves the safety of U.S. citizens and improves the safety by eliminating drugs before they reach our borders. Previously, decades ago, we addressed the drug issue at the borders. And you can't get all the shipments of drugs coming into the borders. So in 1980, under President Ronald Reagan, the supply side was moved to go after the traffickers in their countries at the source to address those issues and to build capacity with partner law enforcement, to increase our intelligence capability, sharing, to address this problem before these drugs reach the border. Operation Snowcap was the first international program that started in 1986. The plans were formulated in 1986. So let me give you a little history of what brought about Operation Snowcap. In 1980, the cocaine epidemic was expanding. Cocaine was coming from Latin American countries. President Ronald Reagan identified it as a national security threat. And cultivation from several countries, initially Bolivia and Peru, were producing the vast majority of the world's base cocaine product that was needed to be refined in HCL labs in Colombia. So that was known as the Andean problem, the source countries. So to go ahead and address that, we had to go to the sources. We had to go where the drugs are being grown, where they were being manufactured, to go and try to interdict and disrupt those flows. So this was the start of Operation Snowcap. Plans were formulated in 1986. 1987, the first Snowcap agents were deployed to Latin America countries, predominantly Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, and then Ecuador. The program expanded additionally further to other countries, but in smaller scale, for mostly intelligence sharing and collection. So the Operation Snowcap saw growth in many phases. To digress back a little bit how Snowcap came into play, 82, President Reagan declared drugs a national security issue. So this brought additional resources. In 86, amendments to the Foreign Assistance Act introduced that countries that were source countries, before they could get any international funding, they had to show means that they were doing something about the drug problem in their country and the production of drugs and the facilitation of drugs before the U.S. government would give them any international aid and funding. Based on that, the first operation, Operation Blast Furnace, okay, at the request of the Bolivian president then, in 1986, requested that the U.S. come in and assist with eradication of laboratories and coca production in Bolivia. In 1986, that was the first expeditionary force composed of U.S. law enforcement, DEA, State Department, and U.S. military. I believe there was 6 Black Hawk helicopters and over 200 and some personnel involved in initial 60 days to 90-day enforcement operations in Bolivia. So based on that Operation Blast Furnace's success, plans were then formulated to go ahead and expand that model into other Andean countries to address the problems in Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador, and other countries. The main focus at that time was Bolivia and Peru and Colombia. Back in those days, the vast majority of coca paste, which is needed to go to the refineries, the HCl laboratories, was produced and controlled by the Bolivian and Peruvian drug traffickers. Colombia then started to, as the years went on, to produce more and more coca within the country. But initially, the cartels, the Medellin and Cali cartels, really depended on the Bolivians and Peruvians to supply the base material for the cocaine production. As mentioned earlier, in September of '86, plans were formulated for Operation Snowcap. In 1987, the initial groups were deployed. However, though, the plan, Operation Snowcap, at the time, in its nation stages, I'm going to refer to this as the 1.0 phase of Snowcap. The agents were ill-equipped, ill-trained. They only received 10 days of training before they were deployed. They received no standard equipment, no standard weapons, no specialized training. And what you're then taking is basically domestic investigators, and you're deploying them into jungle environments to work with the host country nation, law enforcement, to conduct investigations. And so this in itself had very poor reviews. So in 1989, Operation Snowcap operations were suspended. It was twofold. There was a tragic loss of life. Rick Finley in 1989 was killed in an aircraft crash in Peru in a contested combat zone. He wasn't shot down. The plane wasn't shot down. There was 5 Americans that perished that day, Agent Finley and 4 State Department contractors and 1 Peruvian pilot. And that crash was attributed to mechanical failure. So then based on that, DEA headquarters did a review with the State Department and the Inspector General. And they identified these deficiencies in the program. Snowcap then had new leadership too. An individual by who's a legend, and I have a lot of respect for, Frank White. And Mr. White was, a little background about Mr. White. I met Mr. White at my first assignment in San Francisco. He was the San Francisco ASAC, and I reported to him. A very, very impressive individual, a leader. You could tell when you spoke with him and the questions he asked and how he supported his people and the respect that he earned. So Mr. White took over the Snowcap program. He did a bottom-to-top evaluation and drew from his experiences in jungle warfare. Early in his life, Frank White was a first lieutenant, U.S. Army infantry in Vietnam. So Mr. White had seen his fill of operations in jungle environments for the military. He earned the Purple Heart, was wounded in action, and the Silver Star. So based on that, he had the experience. He looked at it and says, we can't expect to put domestic field agents in the field without properly training them, equipping them, and selecting them. And so based on that, the whole program went into, I like to call it 2.0 on steroids. And so the bridge, the wall had come down with between the military and DEA. Previous to that, there was that wall there. Domestic law enforcement, military, that was not really a mix. However, though, based on directives from the White House and everything, that door opened. So Mr. White, based on his experience at the time, was able to go ahead and open those doors to, one, to identify training, to build partnerships, to help identify equipment and train the DEA agents who are being deployed to Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, and other parts in Latin America as part of the Andean strategy. So I always like to say that Frank White was basically the father of this, where we were taking the concept of expeditionary forces, putting them in countries for longer periods of time. This was a first for DEA in its history. Mentioned earlier, Operation Blast Furnace was the first, but this extended periods of time, 90-day rotations of teams into various countries continuously, the building of host country nation capability, training them. And as part of that partnership with the military, there were usually a team of 10 special forces, A-teams they were referred to, that would be at the base camps, and their sole mission was to train the local police that we worked with, the narcotics police, in Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia, to an extent in Ecuador as well. And they would train them. We were the experts. We were trained by the military. We went through a total, it was calculating the weeks of training. We had a week selection at Fort Benning. A lot of people applied, not a lot of people. Some people were not accepted to the program. They were evaluated. Okay, following your acceptance into the program, you went through an 8-week specialized course at Fort Benning, the 75th Ranger Battalion. And this is where the U.S. Army trains all their Special Forces Green Berets. A very tough course. Our course was tailored to our mission. We didn't have to jump out of any airplanes and parachute, which, we didn't really have a need for that. But we did quite a bit of what the military would do. They taught us things. They took the recruit, the investigator, the seasoned investigators from DEA, and turned them into cohesive units to go ahead and address these issues. Basically turned us into frontline advisors and contested jungles to be able to do our job as investigators, to bring that force against the traffickers in their own backyard. So Operation Snowcap evolved over a period of time. In 1990, my first deployment in Snowcap was the time where we were deploying now agents that were trained. They're better trained, they're better equipped, they had more resources, they had military support to do the job. So previously, the agents didn't have that capability. They didn't have the training, they didn't have the equipment. Frank White came in, and we did. And we were effective. So I always like to refer to 1990 as the kind of like a turning point where the heat was turned up on the traffickers in their own backyards, okay? And just a little background information, the seizures went up. Combined, I think in the Andean region, like in 1990, there was 53 metric tons of cocaine seized, 700,000 gallons of precursors, and tens of thousands of arrests, okay, in those countries. At the same time, the U.S. was indicting kingpins, traffickers out of Bolivia, Colombia, and the heat was turned up. The program in the later phases, 1990 to 94, DEA agents were participating in the program at higher risk. Because when you put the pressure on the traffickers, the drug traffickers, in their own backyards, they resent that and they're going to come after you. And so violence, we're always confronted with, each mission had its own challenges. A jungle has its own challenges. A jungle may look beautiful when you're flying over it, but when you're in the jungle, patrolling, you're doing your work, you're investigating, you're going after traffickers, you have to watch for, one, booby traps the traffickers may leave for you, okay, the environment, the poisonous snakes, everything that will bite you or sting you. And so as domestic law enforcement agents who were then trained to go into jungles, that's different from the streets of the U.S. So it was a challenge, but it had its rewards, it has its successes, and it has its sorrow in it as well. But looking back at my participation, the participation of those who I've served with, is we were the first 140 Snowcap personnel, all volunteers, not drafted, volunteers. So that in itself was unique. Previous to Finley's passing in the aircraft crash, no people had been really shot. None of our people in Snowcap had been shot during an armed conflict. Until September of 1990 in Bolivia, in a small cocaine-controlled town controlled by traffickers that was a hub for cocaine paste and base that would be collected and then put on aircraft that would fly to Columbia and HCL laboratories. And as part of a larger operation against the number 3 top drug lord in Bolivia at the time, an individual called Marcelo Meco Dominguez, who I'll talk about later during this interview, one of our agents, Hawthorne Hope, was ambushed by a large force of armed narcotics traffickers during this specific incident. Outnumbered, it was one of those things. I was the team leader that came in with a QRF to pull Hawthorne out, get him medevac, and then deal with the situation against the armed traffickers. I'll discuss that even more further. So based on that, that was the first time in Snowcap's history where DEA had a direct conflict, resulting in one of our agents getting wounded, shot twice, once in the leg and then once in the arm. He's very lucky on that the bullet that hit him in the arm, he had his rifle up. Had he not had his rifle up, he would probably have been hit in the chest, and don't want to think about that. So based on that, we moved forward from 1990 to 94, facing higher risks in performance of our duties in Latin America. And then the most tragic episode that occurred in Snowcap's history was the loss of 5 agents on August 27th, 1994. And that was from an aircraft took off in the Santa Lucia base camp in the Huaga Valley in Peru. And that Snowcap team, those 5 individuals, DEA agents, were on reconnaissance missions. And unfortunately, the aircraft crashed. Mechanical errors is what I recall as being the reason for the crash. And we lost five individuals, friends. Frankie Fernandez Jr., Frankie was the team leader. J.W. Seal, Meredith Thompson, J.C. Vargas, and Frank S. Wallace Jr. I remember him. That is not the kind of the news nobody wants to hear. It's saddening. It's heart-wrenching. It's depressing. That unfortunate loss of those brave individuals who gave all was the downturn of Snowcap. Following changes in administration, from the Bush administration to the Clinton administration, new leadership at DEA headquarters, another strategy was decided to go forward, and Snowcap was drawn down and disbanded following that. So that is basically a little summation of the DEA history of Snowcap. How did it come into play? Why did it come into play? To address the expanding problem with cocaine. In the 80s, late 80s, we saw the expansion of the crack cocaine. Kind of in parallel, when you look at it, it was the biggest problem, a national security issue back in the 80s. Several presidents agreed with that, and it had to be addressed. And then you fast forward and you look at the fentanyl crisis. national security issue. Hundreds of thousands deaths from overdoses. So almost you look at the drug traffickers don't always peddle their poison into the U.S. And Snowcap was the way to address it long term in those source countries before stopping, disrupting, seizing, going after the money, before it reached the shores and the borders of the U.S. Snowcap operated in 1987 and on, and predominantly the source countries, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. Snowcap also expanded its operations into other countries, but on a smaller scale, mostly for intelligence collection, host country, capacity building, intelligence sharing, to go ahead and increase DEA's capability to go ahead and address the issue. So the primary countries, the big were a lot of the resources, the majority, the bulk of the resources were Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia initially. Ecuador had a good share because we dropped teams in Ecuador. That was the first stop. Second stop was Bolivia, actually Peru and Bolivia, and then Colombia, and then the military aircraft that we would go down range on was a C-141, Sky Galaxy. They would drop the teams. So those were the countries involved in Operation Snowcap. Initially, Operation Snowcap, and people ask me, well, why did you get involved? I mentioned earlier that Frank White was my first ASAC on the job when I hired on 1985. He called me into his office the second day that I was in the San Francisco office, and he was putting together a SWAT team concept for DEA, first ever, which would be equivalent to today's SRT teams. And what he did there was trying to get buy-in from DEA headquarters, because the FBI had their own SWAT teams, and everybody, at that time we had to call for assistance to everybody to kick doors on situations, but all that theory changed. So I had a lot of respect for Frank. I helped him with the San Francisco SWAT concept training. I helped him guide, give him suggestions, etc., the whole bit, because I had previously been a sheriff's deputy in Fresno, California. And one of my duties, I was a SWAT officer, as well as a seasoned narcotics investigator and special investigations unit. So we worked a lot with DEA as well. So when Mr. White transferred to headquarters to Quantico, and he was put in charge, the phone rang, and he says, I need some people. And so the cable came out for volunteers. I volunteered. Next thing I was doing, I was going through a selection course. I was going through a modified Army Ranger school designed specifically for DEA, working in pervasive jungle operations. After that, we would then, before we deployed, we would go through a week refresher course in Panama. And we always used to like to call that training Welcome to the Jungle. Well, Welcome to the Jungle is the name of a famous song by Guns N' Roses. So when we got off the plane in Panama, the heat and everything, and it puts your mind in perspective that now, before you go downrange, this is a tune-up, and get ready. So I deployed my first tour in 1990. I was an assistant team leader, and I was a team leader for quite a few of the operations, while the supervisor was at other locations or whatever. So I initially was a team leader in Snowcap. Later in my career, after returning back to the States in 1990, I got a phone call from Don Ferron. Don Ferron was a country attaché in Bolivia at the time. And the concept was to go ahead and expand the country teams, the offices in these countries, and then staff them with Snowcap trained people that had deployments, and then the leadership. And the most important thing too, which as Snowcap progressed, it got better and better as we learned and we adapted to address the issues, the challenges, and to overcome them. So one of the things is, in the initial Snowcap deployments, is that a team would arrive for 90 days. The first 20, 30, 40 days, you're looking for sources to put together operations. So you're recruiting human sources, informants, you're trying to identify targets, you do that. So the wisdom in DEA says, well, we can do this better. We don't have to have a team down for X amount of days trying to put together operations. So we can train and we can select from the Snowcap teams to the permanent assignments. So based on that, I promoted real quick to resident agent in charge for Cochabamba. Well, Cochabamba covers all the Chapare, the growing regions of that. So I had agents who were Snowcap trained, embedded with the Snowcap teams. So when the teams arrived, we had target packages. We were working targets against the highest level traffickers. We had work where they had one down day and they were working, doing 2 ops a day. So we just had a constant flow. So that part of Snowcap greatly improved in 91, 1990, 91, 92, 93. And I was part of that operation until 94 when we got our stand down orders. DEA Snowcap had many partners. I mentioned earlier that the wall between the U.S. military, DOD, the door had been opened. So our U.S. partners, U.S. military, Department of Defense, we had partnerships with U.S. Border Patrol, BORTAC, military units that I'd like to give a special recognition because these guys were fantastic. They're true patriots, and the lessons we learned from them kept us alive. And without their knowledge and without that training, I hate to think of what the outcome could have been even worse than it was. So we worked with the 1st Special Forces Operation Detachment Delta Force. These guys are fantastic. Later in my life, when I retired from DEA, I had the honor to work with Triple Canopy, which they're all prior Delta. And the honor was that they invited me into their ranks. And I never served in the military, but I'd worked with them in previous my early days in Snowcap, and then in Afghanistan when I had overview of Afghanistan operations. Also the 7th Group Forces, the Green Berets, U.S. Army Special Forces 75th Ranger Training Brigade in Fort Benning, Georgia. We were some of the first non-military units to go through training in Fort Benning. Navy SEALs. The SEALs in Coronado taught us small boat tactics and riverines because there's a lot of water in the jungles. And you need to know how to safely navigate them because we were doing interdiction operations on the water. We were doing interdiction operations on land and in the air. So Coast Guard was also part of our Snowcap deployment teams. They were the boat guys. They knew how to operate boats. And so then our local forces that we worked with in each of the countries. In Bolivia, it was the Bolivian Special Counter-Drug Police called the UMAPAR. They were known as the Leopardos, jungle fighters. They were good. The Special Forces A teams made them even better. They were equipped. Initially, when Snowcap was started, they were ill-equipped, ill-armed, and they were basically ineffective. They weren't really highly trained. That was all changed. So they were good partners with us going out into the field. We were then acting as advisors, frontline advisors, on the ground, not back in the rear in the gear, say, hey, go do this. We were out there with them daily. Bolivian Navy, Bolivian Air Force pilots that flew the U.S. helicopters, they were trained in Fort Rucker, Georgia. There were some great pilots. I put a lot of airtime in those old helicopters. We're flying in the same helicopters that flew in Vietnam. the single engine UH-1 Hueys. You got one engine. So if you got hit by a parrot or a macaw, your engine's going to flame out and you're going down hard. So I had a lot of respect for those pilots. Peruvian National Police, fearless, really good. They'd been fighting the Sendero Luminoso, the Shiny Path, for years. They knew the jungle, they knew their background. But combination of Special Forces training and DEA training refined them, made them better, which increased the effectiveness of the Snowcap program. And then the Colombian National Police. Colombian National Police have been at war with terrorists, the FARC, for years. So they knew the jungles. It was their backyard. They were great comrades to work with. They were great partners to work with. So those are just some of the people that I can remember. State Department was great. Got a lot of funding from State Department. We just had lots of partners. The intelligence agencies too. We worked with them periodically and stuff. And the apparatus of intelligence flowed. It was a one-team concept. It was partnerships, which was the beauty of things. It wasn't just like, hey, these are my toys, you can't have them. It was a U.S. effort, a combined effort. And that in itself was that catapulted DEA into the future to address these issues that are constantly changing and flexing, and that as time goes on, it's a new issue. But it gave us the DNA and the basic foundation to address them. I would say our greatest asset was human intelligence. Intelligence. Because intelligence drives your operations. And then working with our host nation law enforcement, specialized units. But to go ahead and do that, you need to vet them, train them, increase their capacity, which increases the collection of intelligence, recruiting informants, moving information to go ahead and make your operation successful and target specific areas that need to be addressed. So human intelligence, your host nation partnerships. As forward deployed advisors, we brought that to bridge that and grow those capabilities in those specific countries. Then the assets. You need air assets, you need logistics, you need equipment. So our partnership with DoD that provided a lot of that, and State Department was critical. Surveillance, reconnaissance, aircraft, satellites, listening equipment. That's the whole approach of the U.S. government, to provide that. Because if you do not have that whole toolkit, that tool bag, to be able to reach in there and use these certain assets, that would negatively affect your mission. So our partnerships, as I named earlier, the ones that I spoke of, are crucial. And those partnerships are, as they go forward in time to address things, they will remain to be very critical. I would say the greatest challenge was corruption, because you're taking, and then this is what I would experience, and I speak for this because I experienced the corruption. So you're taking, and you're working in an environment, well, corruption is almost accepted. Police are not highly paid, they're not highly educated in some countries a little better than others. So information is of value, and if they can sell the information, they will sell it to the traffickers, who have unlimited resources to corrupt, to bribe, and pay. So corruption was always the biggest. So how we addressed that in our approach was we vet those units, of specialized units we work with, polygraph, we work with them, check information, we would do all that to go ahead and make sure that information was protected. Because out there, information is king, and they could bargain that, they could trade that for money, et cetera, the whole bit. So corruption was our number one, my number one problem. I had one instance where we were doing a briefing. Brief the colonel. Colonel disappears on me. We catch him. He's on his phone. And then we look at his phone records later, and he had called the trafficker to let him know we're coming. So we ran into that all the time. And then when we were successful in seizures, then the traffickers with, the threats. So in Bolivia and other countries, the traffickers put bounties on our head. So as we became more effective, that was one of their ways to put a $50,000 bounty on an agent's head, or if it was a higher official, the money could be more. So that was one of the issues, our safety constantly. You had the mission, you're out. You had to worry about aircraft falling, failing. You had to worry about the jungle environment. It could bite you, sting you, kill you. You had to worry about the traffickers who would shoot at you, who would, they didn't want to give up their drugs, et cetera. And then, so you had a lot of different things. You had a lot of challenges. Logistics was another big thing. Okay. We were flying around, as I mentioned, doing air assault. Mostly in the jungles, there's no roads. The only way to get to an objective, to a lab or a processing place, is by air. And so it was air mobility, air cav, et cetera, the whole bit. And that's how we jumped on the helicopter, we flew to the mission, accomplished the mission, and then that's how we got back home. Same on the rivers. So there was also a lot of logistics, equipment. I learned a lot about Murphy's Law, Mr. Murphy. Gained a lot of respect for Murphy. Learned about Murphy when I went through Ranger training. They always taught us that what can go wrong may go wrong. And you don't want to get hit between the eyes and drop to your feet because you may not recover. So you have to be able to think about that and address those issues and adapt to that to survive. And so we always had in our planning, because we did military five-paragraph ops planning that the military provided us with, and then DEA modified it. And so it always had that what if, how, so if helicopter fails, this, QFRs can't make it or whatever, what do you do? What's your backup plan? So it always taught us about the backup plan, and those lessons really helped and saved a lot of us and kept us safe. The terrain and objective, like I mentioned earlier, that was a big challenge. I mean, I saw my share of poisonous snakes. And so on my first deployment, I says, well, do we have anti-venom? Yeah, we do. It's in the refrigerator. It has to stay refrigerated. So if you're out for several days in the jungle, no go. So I asked the medic, I said, what happens if I get bit by a fer-de-lance? Stay calm, because chances are you're not going to make it. At the base camp in Chimaray, we would see the local people coming in, and they had a medical facility where they treated a lot of locals for various injuries. It's kind of like the hearts and minds. That's what the special forces do. That was part of the A-team's responsibility. These poor people would come in, and some of them perished. They'd bring in the dead snake, cut in half. And so we learned that as we're out on patrol, you'd see clusters of bananas, and we're tired of eating MREs and stuff, of fresh fruit. Don't go there, because that was a home where this famous deadly green banana viper, there was chartreuse that in there, and you're picking a banana, next thing you know, you get hit on the arm, or you get bit on the other parts of your body. They didn't make it. So there was just a lot of different things that could bite you, sting you, kill you in the jungle. Not to worry about the drug traffickers that are trying to shoot you and kill you as well, but the environment. The other thing was intelligence gaps. We would get information, and then it was trying to get information back in a timely fashion for action. We were fortunate at times. We'd have a satellite overview of areas that we were looking at planning for operations, but satellites were only good because they can't see through the cloud cover back in the day. Back in the 80s and 90s, that was one of the biggest things. Communications. We carried around squad radios. And then we carried around the PRC 77 and then the man-packed squad radios, mostly HF, VHF. So we had to carry extra batteries. And we were loaded down with a battle amount of ammunition, water, grenades, first aid kits, a couple of MREs, clothing, everything. So we were weighted down with a lot of things. So the communication is the biggest thing, because if you got in trouble or you needed to maneuver or you needed to call for help, if your equipment didn't work in the middle of the jungle, and that was very difficult. The triple canopy was hard to bounce out signals. So communication was one of the big issues. Fast forward, a lot of that with technology, that's not such an issue nowadays. But back in the day, in a jungle, operating many miles away from your base camp, that was an issue. The other big thing was the legal and forensics capabilities that we had access to. Host country nations, their forensics capabilities were almost non-existent. So getting those capabilities, those gaps to assist us in our investigations from the U.S. and other things was quite of a challenge. Okay, they could do basically fingerprinting, but they really didn't have capabilities to go ahead and do mass identification of fingerprints. DNA wasn't in existence then. Okay, so when you look at all the things back in the late 80s and 90s, and as technology and everything is advanced, we didn't have those advantages. So the way if they were identifying fingerprints, they did the old-fashioned way, which I did when I was, started my career as a deputy sheriff, is you put the loop and then you look at the patterns and you try to score them. That's what we were faced with. Just the forensics issues were big issues. The signal collection, we would listen to the traffickers would try to listen to us, we'd have encrypt, and so we were playing that cat and mouse game. As in 1993 was the first year we saw cell phones in the Chipari. So that was another challenge. So the technology to go ahead and collect those cell phone information under Bolivian law, that was a challenge. So some of the laws didn't initially have that capability. So we were looking at logistics, forensics, legal capabilities, restrictions. So and then there were political ramifications on things and guidance and everything. So we're always confronted with something, but we always were good at figuring out to adapt, to work around it, so we could complete the mission and advance the mission. I received some of the best training at the time for Operation Snowcap in the 2.0 phase. And I'm very unfortunate that the initial Snowcap agents, the first boots on the ground from 87 to 89, received very little training. And as I previously stated, Snowcap was suspended in 89. And then part of the new advanced training to provide us with the skill sets to do the mission, that was provided and mandated in 1989. I was a product of one of the first Snowcap trainings that involved a selection, a week-long selection to weed out people that they figured maybe, hey, this is not for me. The 8-week school at Fort Benning, taught by the 75th Ranger Training Battalion, customized for DEA, how to address the issues you would face, how to operate in a permissive jungle environment, how to react to ambushes, how to provide medical care, combat emergency medicine, how to communicate, utilizing equipment, team building, and molding, like I mentioned earlier, molding domestic investigators into cohesive units, small team tactics. providing them with the tool sets, the knowledge, and to go ahead and survive and complete their jobs in a permissive jungle environment. Basically, they were turning us into frontline combat advisors. I know a lot of people don't like the word combat, but it was in some instances where a bullet doesn't know the difference between you if it's coming at you, and there's a lot of things that you have to react to and address. That gave us the mindset. That gave us the training. So based on the completion of that, and as I mentioned earlier in the interview, then we would get the refresher training prior to deployment, 1 week in Panama in the jungles. Welcome back to the jungle. Then we deployed. And so then when we came back to the States, we had always had the opportunity to go ahead and attend additional training, small boats training in Coronado, other training, to go ahead and build your skills. Prior to all deployments, agents went through 3 months of language school to learn Spanish. Okay, that gave you a basic fundamental knowledge of the Spanish language, the ability to communicate with your foreign counterparts who spoke mostly Spanish. They spoke very little English, so to communicate in an operation and to work with them, you need to speak their language. So that was crucial. So based on that, we in the schools we learned various things: close quarter combat, air assault, aerial gunnery. So we got behind M60s and we could shoot M60s from a helicopter if we were being fired upon. Land navigation. This is no land navigation where I turn on my cell phone and it tells me where to go. This is all compass and maps. Compasses, maps, land navigation, beads, map contours, everything. How do you get across a river when you come to a river? So the Rangers taught us, well, you take one man, you tie a rope around his waist, he strips down and he swims across the river. He ties the rope across the river and then the rest of the team crosses, holding onto the rope. So we did that. One time we almost lost an agent. He got sucked under a current. He fortunately popped up, but it was one of those things that, wow. So the river could get you and take you down. So it was things that you always had to look at and where you put your hand. You want to rest your hand on a tree. Black palm. Could be a snake there. There could be a spider. There was so many different venomous spiders. So we were taught to learn how to deal with a lot of these various situations based on experience that the U.S. military had learned from previous engagements in different war zones over the years. So those lessons were passed and taught to us. So we dealt with booby traps, IEDs, ground assaults, and we learned leadership and refined our leadership to the next level. So the specialized gear that we utilized was based on what we were taught and what we had. So we went through the Army Ranger Training School for DEA. We were provided with and we were deployed with some of the latest weapons that were available. M16A2 is a short version of an M16. Our counterparts were equipped with M16 rifles. Knives, web gear, canteens, first aid kits, grenades. We learned how to use demolition, carry C4 for destroying things, cratering charges to crater and blow up airstrips. So we learned a lot of different things, not like your average street agent would learn. So the military taught us how to do this, where we became comfortable in performing and working with this equipment. We had sidearms in the U.S. We had a variety of equipment. Squad M60s on the helicopters that I mentioned, claymores. We had claymores at times. We knew how to use claymores in case they need to be deployed. I never deployed any, but at least we had them and knew how to use them if we had them. So we learned how to do a lot of different used a lot of different equipment. We wore military uniforms. Woodland camo was a camouflage pattern at the time. Our counterparts wore the same uniforms. So in an action, they couldn't tell the difference. You all had the same uniform on. We jungle boots, because the jungles are a very wet environment, and you're constantly dealing with the moisture that affects a body. Your feet get very wet, and if they're wet after a period of time for so long, then you start having skin issues. And I can always remember this famous thing from Forrest Gump, and I won't forget this. When Forrest Gump deploys to Vietnam, and his platoon lieutenant tells him, "Socks, so very important to keep your feet dry. If not, the jungle will eat them off." Very true. And we heard that in Army Ranger School, and it was the ungodless truth. So we always carried dry socks, foot powder, and when you could, you had to maybe check your feet, because that's how you got around, walked on your feet. And we had guys that were just constantly addressing foot issues, everything, because you're in a wet, damp environment. You're constantly getting rained on in the rainy season. So trying to stay dry, it was a big challenge. So those were just some of the gear and issue that we had. We issued radios, military type radios, satellite communication phones. Some of the first sat phones were in a big briefcase. And so before I could bounce off a satellite, I had to make sure that I had a satellite in view. I had to take this big apparatus out. I had to set up this big cone antenna, aim it up at the sky where I thought the satellite was before I could make comms. Not like the satellite phones now that are small, flip up the antenna, line of sight outside, and you can communicate. Nothing like that, okay? So that was just a taste of some of the equipment that we had access to. So Carmelo Meco Dominguez, just to give everybody a flavor of the hierarchy of the Bolivian drug lords. So at the time in the late 80s and 90s, Carmelo Meco Dominguez was ranked as the number 3 drug lord in Bolivia. He controlled basically all the cocaine paste distribution to the Medellin and Cali cartels by air bridge, aircraft, etc., the whole bit. So people ask me, how did he rise to that? So I'm going to go back a little bit to the 80s, okay, to kind of frame this and put this in perspective to see how the traffickers morphed, how law enforcement had effect against these traffickers, and then bring us into the 90s, which we saw uptick in violence. We saw the traffickers really coming after us because we were being very effective. So in December of 1990, Jorge Roca Suarez, okay, was arrested. He was arrested in San Marino, California, during the DEA raid. 30 charges, federal charges, money laundering, trafficking, the whole bit. So Jorge Roca Suarez was the son of Roberto Suarez Gomez. Okay, and in 1980, Roberto Suarez Gomez was known as the king of cocaine. So Suarez Gomez supplied Pablo Escobar. And you can do the Google search, you can reach and do the research on it. And in preparation for this, I did a little research. And so he once said that he could shut down Pablo Escobar and the Colombian cartels by not supplying them for a week because with cocaine paste. Because at that time, he was the king of cocaine, probably one of the most powerful drug lords in the world at that time. So the character, a lot of people have heard of the movie Scarface. All right, so the character in the 1983 American crime film Scarface was based on Roberto Suarez Gomez, the king of cocaine. So a little history of trivia there. So in 1988, the king of cocaine, Roberto Suarez Gomez, was arrested on drug charges. He was incarcerated in Bolivia. So an incarceration in Bolivia is a little different than incarceration in the United States. But he was nevertheless in prison, still very influential in the cocaine trade. Okay? And then his first cousin, Luis Arce Gomez, who was a previous Bolivian interior minister under the 1980 dictator Hugo Banzer, who Suarez Gomez put in place to run the government, was arrested in the United States by DEA for drug trafficking. So you have circumstances. You have the downfall of several of these kingpins at the same time, within years, as a result of being able to go ahead and investigate these individuals for U.S. crimes as well as crimes in their countries. So then you have the rise of Carmelo Meco Dominguez, because when there's one kingpin lord taken out, somebody's going to fill that vacuum to a degree. Okay, he stepped in. And the way the cocaine paste distribution networks were established in Bolivia, you had the Chapare, which is the largest, you had the Beni, and then you had the Santa Cruz areas. And they were all kind of divided up into areas and stuff. And they worked kind of not in unison. Some had more control than the others. But Dominguez at the time, he was up on everybody's radar. So, and Dominguez was arrested in 1990 by the Bolivians and DEA as part of a combined operation. And in September, that operation focused on several locations, Santa Cruz, Beni, and Chapare. And so based on that, charges were brought and he was taken out of the picture. That had a big effect on who the Colombians were now dealing with, because a lot of the hierarchy of the Colombian drug lords was basically decapitated. And DEA is really good at going after high-level targets, building cases. And then Snowcap was good because we were the action arm on a lot of intelligence and search warrants and raids and stuff, because we had the training and capability, plus we were collecting information to build those cases with our host nation counterparts. The operational incident that occurred on September 24th, 1990, as I previously mentioned, it was an operation targeting the Carmelo Dominguez cocaine trafficking organization. So the operation, there were several operations that day. Operations in Santa Cruz, operations in Beni, they were coordinated, synchronized operations targeting various labs, structures, arrests for individuals, etc., the whole bit, and building a case to go ahead and prosecute Dominguez and his cocaine organization. So the Chapare base camp, the Chimare base camp, had intelligence from the operation on a stash location, stash house. And the way these stash houses worked is that the base would come in, they would put it at a location, aircraft would fly in from Colombia or other parts if they're going to transit to other locations. Cocaine paste would then come out to the aircraft, they would load the aircraft would fly away. So we put together our operational plan to go after the stash house. And what this operation involved was a lot of pre-planning. We did pre-aerial surveillance. We figured out where we could insert, how we could get observation on the stash house without getting noticed. We had our QFR planned. We knew where our Alamo was. And then for those that are listening, the Alamo is where you're going to tactically retreat to go ahead and hold your position until you can get reinforcements. And so we had our Alamo designation. The Special Forces training cadre at Fort Benning always liked to use the term Alamo. So the term Alamo stuck with us in our battle planning. So on that date, a patrol of Bolivian Leopardos and DEA advisors, 9 of them, okay, 4 agents and 5 Leopardos departed by vehicle to the location along the Izinuta River, near Izinuta. And Izinuta is a small town in the middle of nowhere in the jungle. It has one major road, if you want to call it that, in and out of Izinuta. And this is kind of important to explain because these were the challenges that I would face and our team would face later. The Izinuta River is a wide Amazonian river. Lots of water in it, especially in the rainy seasons, as all rivers and stuff. And normally vehicles could cross it. They could slowly move through the river to cross to the other side, but not in the rainy season. It made it impossible for vehicles to approach from the north to south routes. So the only way in was by the initial road. So as our team inserted outside the outskirts of Izinuta, they established surveillance on the stash location, monitored traffic, could listen to the traffickers, etc., the whole bit. And a patrol of traffickers, armed traffickers, initially the patrol calculated 10. They discovered where the DEA and Umpar Leopardo's vehicles were at. And they were hidden along the riverbank of the Izinuta. There were 2 drivers that were left to watch the vehicles. Okay, they were unarmed drivers, but they were drivers. And the traffickers started firing on those 2 vehicles. And they were shooting the heck out of those vehicles. And the drivers were pinned down. They get on the radio and they says, "Help, we need help. We're taking fire from multiple locations." So the patrol that was on the observation point of the stash house had to pull back through the jungle and had to move towards the trapped patrol. As they got close to the river, and we're talking probably about, this is not like it's a few feet away, you're going through thick, dense jungle to get back to the river. As they came up to the river, they came online, okay, part of our training, our indoctrination, and to advance. And during that time, Special Agent Hawthorne Hope was shot twice in the ambush. He was hit once in the leg and once in the arm. He goes down. The medic, Tom South, who just phenomenal guy. He was a DEA contractor hired by DEA for the Snowcap program, and he was a former Special Forces medic. So Tom knew how to operate in these type of environments. Tom drags Hawthorne back, the team's engaged, and it's a firefight. Bad guys are trying to shoot us, and we're trying to survive. The team then is being advanced. The traffickers are trying to cut them off, they're trying to flank them, and the team is trying to retreat back to the Alamo. The Alamo is a distance away. So during that, there's a run and gun battle. The patrol shooting at traffickers are shooting at them. Bullets are flying. And you have a wounded agent. He's going into shock. And you're dragging him, and you're trying to get to a safe location where you can treat his wounds. So Tom South treats him. He gets him going. He's dragging him. They're shooting. It's a gun battle. They get into their position, pre-designated position, the Alamo. They finally make radio contact with us, and I activate the QFR. The QFR was a quick reactionary force consisting of 2 helicopters, 10 of us. So we load up within minutes, and we're airborne, because I've got a 20-minute flight. It's a 20-minute flight from the base camp to where their operation position is. And so we're flying right over the trees because that's the safest place to be. You don't want to be up 1,000 feet in the air. You get shot at a lot more that way. So we're right over the trees coming in. We, at the same time that we launched QFR-1, we launched QFR-2. QFR-2 is about 50 personnel, Leopardos, and the remainder of the DEA camp, which is another 7 or 8 guys. And they depart by vehicle. But that QFR was not going to arrive, wouldn't get there for about an hour and 20 minutes. So the people on the ground didn't have that time. So we arrive, and I have a good idea where the patrol is going to be, and they shoot a signal flare up through the jungle, and I can see it. So as we come in and back over the river, I'm looking at our vehicles that are on fire. And then I see people with rifles shooting at us. And so fire is returned. The initial patrol was very successful, though, in getting the trapped drivers out. So at that time, the only injury, the wounded person, was Hawthorne Hope. So we fly around. I've got 2 helicopters on scene. I land, exit the, I'm going to refer to this just to keep everything straight, is QRF-1A. That's the first helicopter that touches down. We load, get off, bound and move towards the patrol that's at the Alamo. Get in there, I get a situational awareness, and I call in that helicopter that helicopter 1A. It comes in and does the medevac. The Alamo is described as, and why we picked this and the way we picked it is, it's hard to get people in and out of a triple canopy if you got to rappel in. And we didn't have the gear to go ahead and put them on a stretcher and rappel out. But then your helicopter's exposed and it's a sit and duck. So we picked areas in the jungles that there was a lot of deforestation going on. Loggers would come in and they would knock down all these areas, and that gave us a good location, and it gave the patrol cover of downed trees that were being harvested as fighting positions, and then I could bring the helicopter in. We would have to hover, it had to hover 5 feet, and then we had to load up, get Agent Hope onto the helicopter and medevac him out. We had another medic on the bird, and away they go to get him to back to Chimaray, so he can get stabilized, and we had an aircraft waiting then to get him to Santa Cruz for surgery. So we're on the ground. I get situation awareness. I can hear the second QRF helicopter 1B. It's being shot at. I can see the tracers. You can hear the gunfire. You can hear the distinction from the M60 shooting back at the traffickers. So the fire lulls a little bit. I bring in that helicopter, which 5 agents, you can only put 5 people with packs, gear on a helicopter. Helicopter carries a max load of 2 pilots, a crew chief, and a gunner. So you only put 9 people on those helicopters. If you put more, your weight distribution is going to be all bad, and you could have issues. So we get on the ground, and then the helicopter says, "Hey, we got a large group moving towards your position." So what the traffickers did was they regrouped, and they figured there was about 25 armed traffickers at the time. They were using civilians then, pushed them forward, headed towards our position as human shields. So I go, this is not a tenable position. So I had 1 helicopter and I had 20 people on the ground. So I brought the first helicopter in and says, well, we're going to do a tactical retreat. I'm going to put a cork in this bottle real quick. So as I mentioned earlier, there was a road that comes in, one way in, one way out. And so the first helicopter, I went on with 4 other agents, and we moved to a tactical position on the road, the main road going to Ezinuta. I figured I could prevent traffickers from reinforcing and prevent from escaping. And that's what that did. The SF teams during Ranger training taught us that. So then the helicopter went back to pick up the next group and do that. They figured that the unarmed civilians being pushed by the traffickers it would take them 20 minutes to get to our position. I had everybody out of there in 15 minutes. So on the first drop, when I got into position, we set up a hasty roadblock. Umpar, the Leopardos were out. I was out with them to stop any vehicles going and coming into Izinuta. Izinuta was about 2 miles from that location. I wanted a little distance. I wanted these traffickers to think that, okay, maybe these guys tucked their tail and they ran. We weren't running that day. So first truck comes at us, and he can see us and everything, and you never forget the sound of that carburetor kicking in and that engine revving, and it's coming at you. So we fired on the vehicle. By the grace of God, nobody was hurt. No traffickers were killed. Nobody from the patrol was injured, but the vehicle was disabled. We ended up arresting two of the shooters that ambushed the patrol and put an effective blockade in place. So the other groups joined us. We had the other 2 volleys, and then my helicopter, the Bird, he's got only so much fuel time where he can stay in the air. And so I've got 20 people on the ground. We're in the ditches. We're controlling everything. We're not letting anything move in and out of Izinuta. And he goes, I'm out of here. I got to go fuel. And so go fuel. I want you both back on scene when you can. So we stayed in that position until the QFR2 of the vehicles with additional resources arrived. At the same time, radio comms put out to the embassy, put out to everything, and there was 4 helicopters in Santa Cruz finishing up their missions. Santa Cruz helicopters are 3 hours away. The distance, logistics, refueling, etc., before they could get to us. So initially, when the QRF I think it was about close to 50 people joined us, we then had enough people to go ahead and do a sweep through Izinuta. As a result, long story short, we arrested about 18 of the people, traffickers. We seized military-grade weapons, grenades, etc., the whole bit, radio equipment, and so we carried the day there. So we, based on our planning, it saved our lives. And we got Hawthorne Hope out. Unfortunately, he was wounded, but he recovered in the United States. He was a recipient of DEA's Purple Heart, which wasn't awarded until 1996 because DEA didn't have a program at the time to recognize his sacrifice. The team received accolades for their bravery, professionalism, and carrying out the mission. And I was just happy to be part of it, to lead the people and be part of that team. Even though that was 36 years ago, I still remember it. Snowcap helped advance DEA's mission in late 1980s to currently. And you may ask, well, how? Snowcap was the blueprint, the DNA, the birth of paramilitary DEA operations. It transitioned an agency, DEA, from a domestic investigator body into a global force capable of operating in high-threat, non-pervasive environments for extended periods of time. So you basically took DEA's capabilities as elite investigators for drug traffickers, money laundering, disrupting supply chains, applying the rule of law outside the U.S. borders into the trafficker's backyard, where drugs are manufactured, transported, etc. So Snowcap was that blueprint. I mentioned earlier Operation Blast Furnace was the first expeditionary activity involving U.S. law enforcement, DEA, State Department, and the military, and host country national law enforcement. So Snowcap gave us the experience, lessons learned, to go ahead and apply those lessons to future operations. 16 years later, we're in Afghanistan. The threat there is poppy, opium, heroin, in a war zone, a bona fide war zone, where it doesn't matter who you are, you're getting shot at. And then the lessons we learned from Snowcap applied to the training, the equipping, the rebonding, the building of partnerships with DOD, the intelligence communities, the host nation, building their capacities in the host nation, like we did in Bolivia, vetting, teaching, training, working side by side with them, in the wire, behind the wire, outside the wire, going after production, heroin facilities, eradication, and going after high-value targets. In 2008, I was transferred from San Francisco to headquarters and put in charge of, as a section chief of Office of Global Operations. At that time, in the process of the Afghan war, one of the biggest things that the Taliban used was the opium trade to fund their war machine. They needed the drugs to sell, to earn money, to fuel their insurgents. That was one of the big problems. Prior to the fall of Afghanistan, opium was a problem. It's always been a problem. It's been the problem there in that area for decades. DEA was brought in. Part of my charge was to go ahead and take an office, the Kabul country office, which consisted of roughly about 8 or 9 people, a couple agents, intel analysts, et cetera, the whole bit, and expand that operation at an NSA directive to go ahead and increase the office size to 80 agents and a total of 130 personnel. So here we come back, and I'm looking at this. And at the time, in DEA's history, when the Afghan expansion came about, there wasn't many Snowcap agents in leadership positions that had the knowledge. And so when I was given the task, I stepped forward and I says, I'll do this. And part of my task was the selection of people, put out the cable, get the volunteers, do the selection, make sure that's what they want to do, weed them out, not just send anybody. And then we had to train them. So then knocked on the door of the military, opened the door, and I wanted training with special forces to be able to take agents, okay, domestic investigative agents, who are now going to be put into a war zone, a real war. And that took training. So I put together a customized 10-week training with the military in planning, operational, working out of a forward operating bases, running drills, ambush, helicopter insertions, weapons familiarization, all kinds of different things, from shooting 50 caliber machine guns to rockets, to everything that you could be faced with in a battlefield in Afghanistan. Because I didn't want agents to go out into the field working alongside with U.S. military or ISAF forces and to be a liability. And for an investigator to be able to apply his or her trade as an investigator, they need to know how to operate in a very pervasive, very dangerous environment. So the lessons from Snowcap transition to Afghanistan and to FAST flash forward. That was paramount. It was required, and we had not forgotten those lessons. And a lot of those lessons today are still implemented within DEA. Host country nation law enforcement building, very important. Those programs are still in existence, and those are the blueprints that are employed in many, many offices across the globe that DEA works in. You build capacity, you improve intelligence, you become more effective as a tool that you can use to go ahead and address the issue with drug trafficking. Don't wait for it to come to the borders. You'll never interdict all of it at the borders. You have to go to the source countries, and you have to work with your partners to address the issue. Much like the FAST teams, they deployed for limited periods of time, 90 days, etc. So in country in Snowcap, you had the offices. And to address this bridge, to make sure that the teams were really, they had no downtime, to limit that downtime, the country teams, who were highly trained later in the Snowcap program, they were the intelligence collectors. They were targeting targets. They were going after networks, traffickers, DTOs, drug trafficking organizations. And they were putting the target packages together. The Snowcap teams would come in for 90 days. Day 2, after their first initial day acclimation, the teams were rolling 2-3 missions a day. The country teams were working hand in hand, same patrols, going after these targets, etc. So we learned that concept. And then that concept translated into Afghanistan. And that was the reason we expanded the size of that office to 80 agents who had to have very similar training than the FAST teams. They had to have training very similar so they could go out with an ODA team, a SEAL team, a Special Forces team, and they could operate so they weren't a liability. So as that transitioned, Afghanistan, FAST teams would come in, they had target sets. And the FAST teams could work on those targets with the KCO and became much more effective. Really sad incident when we lost agents in Afghanistan. That was a mixture of FAST and KCO. Michael Weston, I knew Michael. He was trained, he went through the KCO training program, but he was a major in the Marine Corps too. So I had a conversation with him. I says, hey, I'm selecting you for this because I want you to impart your knowledge to the people that are not as experienced like you have, because he did several tours in Iraq. So he was a battle veteran. Grab them, mentor them, help them. And unfortunately, he was the first one from the KCO to pass in action. Not because of the firefight, helicopter. So I bring that about to mention, to remember. Yeah. Lessons that I learned, we learned, DEA learned, they just didn't go away. And you have to take those lessons and then put people in charge that, I've seen this, I've done that. Yeah. Here's how we can do it. We can do it better though, and we can move. And we did. And that training kept people alive.